The gentle hum of traffic outside the elegant boutique was beginning to fade as evening settled over the upscale shopping district. Inside Style and Grace, Michelle Anderson stood before a mirror, carefully adjusting a designer dress on a mannequin. At 35, she had built her fashion empire from scratch, turning a small online business into 3 successful high-end boutiques. This latest store, nestled in the heart of the city's most prestigious shopping area, was her crown jewel. The soft clicks of her heels echoed through the empty store as she moved between displays, making minor adjustments here and there. She had always believed in being hands-on with her business, often staying late to perfect the visual merchandising herself. Her employees often told her she didn't need to do this anymore. She was the owner after all, but Michelle knew better. It was this attention to detail that had gotten her where she was today. As she worked, her mind wandered to the journey that had brought her here. 10 years ago, she had started selling curated fashion pieces from her tiny apartment. Back then, most people had dismissed her dream of opening a high-end boutique, saying the market was too competitive, too exclusive. Some had even suggested, with thinly veiled prejudice, that she should aim for something more realistic. But Michelle had persevered, channeling every rejection into motivation. The first major breakthrough came when a popular lifestyle blogger discovered her online store. The blogger's post about Michelle's impeccable taste and unique selection went viral, and suddenly, her phone wouldn't stop ringing. Within months, she had saved enough to open her first small storefront in a modest shopping center across town. The soft lighting in the store cast a warm glow over the carefully curated collection of designer pieces. Michelle paused to admire a new shipment of Italian handbags she had unpacked earlier. Each piece told a story of craftsmanship, of style, of the women who would eventually carry them. She had an eye for these things, a talent for spotting pieces that would make her customers feel both sophisticated and comfortable. Her phone buzzed with a message from her mother. "Don't work too late, honey. Remember what the doctor said about stress." Michelle smiled, typing back a quick reply. Her mother had been her biggest supporter, even lending her precious savings when Michelle needed to upgrade her website in those early days. Now, every success felt like a shared victory. The store's security system quietly beeped, reminding her it was almost time to head home. But there was still so much to do. The spring collection launch was next week, and everything needed to be perfect. Michelle moved to the window display, where she began rearranging a collection of silk scarves. The street outside had grown quiet, with only occasional cars passing by the darkened storefronts. She thought about the upcoming fashion show she was hosting, a charity event supporting young entrepreneurs from underprivileged backgrounds. It was her way of giving back, of opening doors for others like herself who had big dreams but limited opportunities. The event planning folder sat open on the counter, filled with seating charts and catering details. As she worked, she hummed along to the soft jazz playing through the store's speakers. Her grandfather had always played jazz in his barbershop, and the music reminded her of watching him work, seeing how he turned his small business into a cornerstone of their community. "Success isn't just about making money," he used to say, "it's about lifting others as you climb." The window displays were beginning to take shape, elegant, sophisticated, yet approachable. That was her signature style, the perfect blend of luxury and warmth that had become her brand's hallmark. She stepped back to assess her work, making mental notes about the final touches needed tomorrow. A sudden movement outside caught her attention, probably the night security patrol making their rounds. She wasn't worried. Most of them knew her by now, had seen her working late countless times. Besides, her recent feature in Business Success Monthly as their Entrepreneur of the Year had made her a familiar face in the shopping district. Little did she know that this ordinary evening was about to take an extraordinary turn, one that would challenge everything she had built and test her in ways she never expected. But for now, she was simply Michelle Anderson, successful business owner, lost in the peaceful routine of perfecting her store, unaware that in just a few minutes, her world would be turned upside down. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, counting down to a moment that would not only change her life, but would spark a conversation that her community desperately needed to have. Outside, footsteps approached the store's entrance, bringing with them a confrontation that would soon make headlines across the city. Robert Thompson straightened his tie and adjusted his newly polished security badge in the mirror of his office. 2 weeks into his position as the shopping district's head of security, and he was already making what he called necessary changes. His predecessor had been too soft, too lenient, he thought. This was an exclusive shopping area, and it needed to be protected. At least, that was how he justified his actions to himself. The security monitors before him displayed various angles of the upscale shopping district. He took pride in how he'd already increased patrol frequency and implemented stricter ID checks for maintenance workers. Some called his methods excessive, but he dismissed their concerns with practiced explanations about maintaining standards and ensuring customer comfort. His desk drawer contained a neat stack of incident reports, most involving what he termed suspicious individuals. A closer look would reveal a troubling pattern in who he considered suspicious, but nobody had dared to question his judgment openly. His previous position at a suburban mall had ended with similar concerns, though he managed to resign before any formal investigations began. "Sir, the new security schedules are ready for review," his assistant called from the doorway, holding a stack of papers. Thompson waved him in, barely glancing up from his computer screen where he was reviewing footage from the previous night. He had already sent 3 warning letters to store owners about their employees loitering after hours, never mind that they were closing up their shops. As evening approached, Thompson began his usual patrol. He walked with an air of authority, hands clasped behind his back, scanning each storefront with exaggerated attention. Store employees who saw him coming quickly straightened displays or pretended to look busy. His reputation for nitpicking and filing complaints had spread quickly through the shopping district. The sound of his polished shoes echoed off the marble floors as he walked past the high-end boutiques. He paused occasionally to make notes on his tablet, a window display that needed adjustment, a trash can slightly out of place, an employee's ID badge worn incorrectly. Each minor infraction was documented with passionate detail. "Evening, Mr. Thompson," called one of the regular security guards, nodding respectfully. Thompson returned the greeting with a curt nod, already noting in his mind that the guard's uniform sleeve was slightly wrinkled, another mark for his ever-growing list of improvements needed. As darkness settled over the shopping district, most stores had closed their doors. Thompson liked this time of day best, when the right people had gone home, and he could focus on keeping out the wrong ones. He never said these thoughts aloud, of course. Years of complaints had taught him to couch his prejudices in more acceptable terms, like maintaining the ambience and security protocols. His radio crackled with routine check-ins from his security team. Thompson responded mechanically while scanning the darkened storefronts. A movement caught his eye, someone moving around inside one of the boutiques. The store's lights were dimmed, but he could make out a figure rearranging something near the window. Thompson's pulse quickened. This was exactly the kind of situation he lived for. He didn't recognize the person inside, and in his mind, that was enough to justify intervention. Never mind that store owners often worked late. He had already decided this was suspicious activity. Reaching for his radio, he began to call in what he termed a potential security situation. His other hand moved to the master keycard all district managers carried for emergencies. In his mind, he was already composing the incident report, imagining the praise he'd receive for preventing a crime. The cold evening air carried the sound of distant traffic as he approached the store's entrance. Through the glass, he could see designer dresses and expensive handbags, prime targets for theft, he reasoned. The figure inside continued to work, unaware of his presence or the confrontation about to unfold. Thompson's fingers tightened around his flashlight as he prepared to enter the store. In his rush to act, he ignored several obvious signs: the figure's professional attire, the confident way they moved through the space, the high-end watch glinting on their wrist. His mind was already made up, and he was about to set in motion events that would expose far more than just a misunderstanding. The electronic lock clicked as Thompson swiped his master keycard. Michelle turned at the sound, her hands still holding a silk scarf she'd been arranging in the display. The store's dim lighting cast long shadows across the polished floor as Thompson burst in, flashlight beam cutting through the semi-darkness. "Don't move." Thompson's voice echoed through the quiet store. "Security, put your hands where I can see them." His flashlight beam danced across Michelle's face, intentionally disorienting her. The beautiful displays she'd spent hours perfecting now cast eerie shadows in the harsh light. Michelle slowly raised her hands, the designer scarf still delicately draped over her fingers. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I'm the owner of this store. You can check my ID." "Sure you are," Thompson cut her off, his tone dripping with disbelief. "Everyone's the owner when they get caught. Step away from the merchandise." He moved closer, his security badge catching the light from the street lamps outside. The soft jazz music still played in the background, creating a surreal soundtrack to the unfolding scene. Michelle took a careful breath, remembering her grandfather's words about staying calm in the face of ignorance. "Sir, my name is Michelle Anderson. This is my store, Style and Grace. If you'll just let me reach for my purse." "Don't move." Thompson barked, reaching for his phone. "I'm calling the police. We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area." He kept his flashlight trained on Michelle, who remained perfectly still, her mind racing through possible ways to defuse the situation. Through the store's windows, she could see curious passers-by beginning to slow down, watching the scene unfold. The security cameras above silently recorded everything. The same cameras she had installed just last month for her employees' safety. Now they were capturing her own moment of crisis. "I have every right to be here," Michelle stated firmly, her professional demeanor never wavering. "If you check the store directory or call the property management office, they can verify." Thompson laughed dismissively. "Right, and I'm sure they'll tell me all about how you own this high-end boutique. Listen, I've dealt with your type before. Always have some story ready." He was already speaking to the police dispatcher, describing what he called a break-in in progress. Michelle felt a mix of emotions: anger, humiliation, disbelief, but years of navigating prejudice in the business world had taught her to maintain her composure. She thought of all the young entrepreneurs she mentored, imagining what advice she'd give them in this situation. Stay professional, document everything, know your rights. The store's lights suddenly came on full brightness. Thompson had found the main switch. The beautiful evening ambience Michelle had created was shattered, replaced by harsh fluorescent lighting that made the situation feel even more surreal. Display cases gleamed, price tags caught the light, and security cameras continued their silent vigilance. "The police are on their way," Thompson announced with satisfaction. "Until then, you're not going anywhere." He positioned himself between Michelle and the door, clearly enjoying what he perceived as a moment of authority. Outside, more people had gathered, phones raised to record the incident. Michelle could see their confused and concerned faces pressed against the windows. Some were regular customers who'd spent thousands in her store, but from this angle, through the glass, they couldn't clearly see who was being held inside. Michelle's phone buzzed in her pocket, probably her mother's reply to her earlier message. The thought of her family learning about this situation made her stomach twist, but she kept her expression neutral. She'd faced discrimination before, but never quite so blatant, never quite so public. "Sir," she tried one more time, her voice clear and professional, "if you'll just listen for a moment." "Save it for the police," Thompson snapped. He was already composing his incident report in his head, imagining how this would prove his worth to the shopping district's board. In his mind, he was the hero of this story, never once considering he might be its villain. The distant sound of police sirens grew closer. Michelle could hear snippets of conversation from the growing crowd outside. Some were filming, others were on their phones, likely calling the shopping district's management office. The evening that had started so peacefully was about to become a turning point, not just for her, but for the entire community. Thompson's radio crackled with questions from other security guards, but he ignored them, focused entirely on what he thought would be his moment of triumph. The sirens grew louder, and red and blue lights began to flash against the store's windows. Neither Michelle nor Thompson knew it yet, but the next few minutes would change both their lives forever. Red and blue lights flooded the boutique as two police cars pulled up outside. Michelle remained perfectly still, her heart pounding but her exterior calm. Through the windows, she could see officers approaching, their faces serious as they assessed the situation. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, their phones recording every moment. "Over here, officers," Thompson called out, his voice filled with misplaced authority. "I've got the suspect contained." He straightened his badge, clearly expecting praise for his actions. The electronic door chimed as the first two officers entered, hands resting cautiously on their belts. The lead officer, Lieutenant Chen, took in the scene. The immaculately dressed woman standing calmly by the designer displays, the overzealous security manager with his flashlight still pointed at her, the expensive boutique with its carefully curated merchandise. Something didn't add up. What seems to be the problem here? Lieutenant Chen asked, his experienced eyes noting every detail. Before Thompson could speak, Michelle responded in a clear, professional voice. "I'm Michelle Anderson, the owner of this store. I was working late arranging displays when this security manager burst in and refused to let me identify myself. She kept her hands visible but gestured with her chin toward her purse on the counter. My ID and business licenses are all in my bag." Thompson scoffed, starting to speak, but Officer Rodriguez, who had just entered, suddenly straightened up. "Ms. Anderson?" "The Michelle Anderson?" he asked, recognition dawning on his face. "I was at the Chamber of Commerce Awards last month. You gave that amazing speech about entrepreneurship." The change in the room was instant. Thompson's confident smirk faltered as Officer Rodriguez continued, "My wife loves your store. She just bought a dress here for our anniversary." He turned to his partner. "Lieutenant, Ms. Anderson won Business Person of the Year. Her picture's in the lobby of City Hall." Thompson's face began to pale as reality crashed in around him. The flashlight in his hand trembled slightly as Lieutenant Chen turned to him with a stern expression. "Did you bother to check her identification before calling us?" She could have been." Thompson stammered, his earlier confidence evaporating. The security cameras whirred quietly above, capturing his mounting discomfort. More officers had arrived outside, but they were now focused on managing the growing crowd of spectators. Through the windows, Michelle could see some of her regular customers trying to explain to others who she was. Phones were still recording, and she knew this incident would soon be all over social media. "Ms. Anderson," Lieutenant Chen said respectfully, "would you like to press charges for harassment?" His tone had completely changed, professional and courteous. The other officers were now looking at Thompson with barely concealed disgust. Michelle straightened her jacket, her dignity intact despite the humiliation she'd endured. "Not at this moment," she said thoughtfully, "but I would like this documented. And I'll be speaking with the district's board about security protocols first thing tomorrow." Officer Rodriguez was already taking notes, while another officer reviewed the security camera footage. Thompson stood frozen, his face ashen, as he realized the full implications of his actions. The incident report he'd been so eager to file would now be written about him instead. I was just doing my job," Thompson protested weakly, but his words sounded hollow even to his own ears. The same prejudices that he'd hidden behind protocol and procedure were now fully exposed under the bright store lights. Michelle's phone buzzed again. News traveled fast, and her mother had probably heard something by now. She could see messages piling up from other store owners in the district, likely alerted by the commotion. This incident would have repercussions far beyond this single evening. Lieutenant Chen was speaking into his radio, updating dispatch about the situation. "False alarm," he said, "unfounded report. Need to document a case of harassment by district security." He gave Thompson a pointed look as he spoke. The jazz music still played softly in the background, an oddly peaceful soundtrack to the chaos that was slowly settling. Michelle could see her reflection in the store windows, still standing tall, still dignified, despite everything that had happened in the last 30 minutes. Thompson's radio crackled with messages from other security guards, but he didn't answer. His hands hung limply at his sides, his flashlight now dark. The authority he'd wielded so confidently just moments ago had crumbled in the face of truth. As the officers began taking official statements, Michelle noticed something that gave her pause. Among the crowd outside, she saw young faces pressed against the glass. Future entrepreneurs, perhaps, watching how she handled this crisis. In that moment, she knew her response would matter far beyond her own situation. By morning, the video had gone viral. Michelle sat in her office above the store, watching as news crews set up their equipment on the sidewalk below. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn, calls from other business owners, community leaders, and journalists all wanting to hear her story. "Have you seen the numbers?" her assistant asked, tablet in hand. The security footage had been shared thousands of times overnight. Social media was buzzing with hashtags about the incident, and the shopping district's reputation was taking a serious hit. The board members had already called an emergency meeting for later that morning. Michelle turned away from the window, her mind clear despite having barely slept. She'd spent most of the night talking with her family, particularly her grandfather. Use this moment, he'd advised. Not for revenge, but for real change. His words echoed in her thoughts as she reviewed the statement her legal team had prepared. The board sent another email, her assistant continued. They're offering to terminate Thompson immediately and issue a public apology. She paused, checking another message. And 3 major fashion magazines want to do feature stories on you and the boutique. The store below was closed for the morning, but supporters had already left flowers and notes by the door. Michelle had read each one, touched by the outpouring of support from the community. Many shared similar stories of discrimination they'd faced while shopping or running businesses. Her mother arrived with breakfast, refusing to let her daughter face this day alone. I saw the interview requests, she said, setting down coffee and pastries. But remember, you don't owe them your story unless telling it serves a greater purpose. Her mother's wisdom, as always, cut straight to the heart of the matter. The security cameras that had captured everything were still running, now watched by crowds of curious onlookers trying to peek through the windows. The same cameras that Thompson had ignored in his rush to judgment were now central to the conversation about prejudice in retail spaces. Michelle's phone buzzed with a message from a young entrepreneur she'd mentored. You showed us how to handle discrimination with dignity, the message read. Thank you for being an example. Similar messages had been pouring in all morning, each one reinforcing her decision about how to handle this situation. The district's board members were scrambling to contain the PR disaster. They'd sent over a thick folder of proposed changes to security protocols, along with a substantial settlement offer. But Michelle had different ideas about resolution. Put together a meeting, she told her assistant, not just with the board, but with all the store owners in the district. And reach out to that diversity consulting firm we worked with last year. She paused, looking at the growing crowd outside. This isn't about one security guard or one incident anymore. Her phone lit up with another call. A national morning show wanting an exclusive interview. Michelle declined, as she had with all the others. She wasn't interested in becoming a viral sensation. She wanted systematic change, not 15 minutes of fame. The store's jazz music played softly upstairs, the same playlist that had been running during last night's confrontation. Michelle found herself humming along, remembering how her grandfather's barbershop had been a place where people from all walks of life were treated with respect. The community center called, her assistant mentioned. They want to know if you'll still be speaking at next week's Young Entrepreneurs Workshop. Michelle nodded firmly. Now, more than ever, she had something important to share with aspiring business owners. Outside, more news vans were arriving. The story was growing, touching on deeper issues that many people recognized from their own experiences. Social media was filled with conversations about racial profiling in retail, about the assumptions people face, about the need for change. Thompson had already been suspended pending investigation, but Michelle knew removing one person wouldn't solve the underlying problems. She pulled out her notebook, the same one where she'd sketched her first store designs years ago, and began outlining a more comprehensive plan. We've got the mayor's office online too, her assistant called out. And the Chamber of Commerce wants to form a task force. The ripples from last night's incident were spreading wider by the hour, creating opportunities for meaningful dialogue and change. Michelle stood up, smoothing her dress, the same one she'd been wearing during the confrontation. She had a full day ahead, meetings to attend, statements to make, and most importantly, a chance to transform an ugly incident into something positive for her community. The conference room of the shopping district's main office was packed. Store owners, security personnel, and board members filled every seat, with more people standing along the walls. 1 week after the incident, Michelle stood at the front of the room, her presence commanding attention without demanding it. We're not here to point fingers, she began, her voice steady and clear. We're here to make real changes. Behind her, a screen displayed the new security protocols she'd helped develop. The room was silent, everyone aware of the viral videos and news coverage that had brought them to this moment. In the back of the room, several security guards shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Thompson's empty chair was a stark reminder of why they were all there. His termination had been immediate once the board reviewed the security footage, but Michelle had insisted that firing one person wasn't enough. Every store owner here should feel safe in their own business, she continued, clicking to the next slide. And every customer should feel welcome in our stores. She outlined her proposal: new training programs, updated security procedures, and a community oversight committee to handle complaints. The cost estimates for these changes flashed on the screen. A board member raised his hand, concern etched on his face. This is a significant investment, he started, but Michelle was prepared for this argument. Less expensive than losing our reputation, she responded calmly, and far less costly than facing discrimination lawsuits. She pulled up statistics showing how similar changes had actually increased profits in other shopping districts by creating a more welcoming environment. A store owner stood up, the elderly gentleman who ran the bookstore next to Michelle's boutique. "I've been here 30 years, he said, his voice shaking slightly. "And I've watched good people leave because they felt unwelcome. It's time for change." Others began sharing their stories. A jewelry store owner described how security followed her own son when he visited her shop. A cafe owner talked about customers who were unnecessarily questioned while sitting at outdoor tables. Each story reinforced the need for the changes Michelle proposed. The district's head of operations, who had initially been skeptical, now nodded along. The viral video of Michelle's incident had affected their bottom line. Several high-profile customers had publicly announced they would shop elsewhere until changes were made. Implementation begins next week, Michelle announced, moving to the final slides. Every security guard will undergo new training. Store owners and employees will participate in workshops. We're creating an anonymous reporting system for both customers and staff. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, another message from her grandfather. He'd been proud of how she'd handled everything, especially her focus on creating lasting change rather than just accepting a settlement and moving on. The local business association had already reached out about implementing similar changes in other shopping districts. Michelle's incident had sparked a larger conversation about retail discrimination across the city. Other business owners were now sharing their own experiences, breaking years of silence. "We're also launching a mentorship program," Michelle continued, revealing her favorite part of the plan: connecting experienced business owners with young entrepreneurs from all backgrounds. She thought of the young people who'd reached out to her after the incident, inspired by how she handled it. The meeting continued for hours, working through details and addressing concerns. By the end, even the most reluctant participants had come around. The shopping district would become a model for others, showing how to create an environment of true equality and respect. Outside the conference room, reporters waited to hear the outcome. Michelle had given only one interview since the incident, focusing on solutions rather than dwelling on what had happened to her. Her story had resonated because it wasn't just about one night or one security guard, it was about changing an entire system. A young security guard approached her after the meeting, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I've wanted to report similar incidents before, but I was afraid. Now we have a way to speak up." This, Michelle realized, was the real victory, giving others the courage to stand up for what's right. The sun was setting as Michelle finally left the office, casting long shadows across the shopping district. Store owners waved as she passed, and even the security guards smiled respectfully. The atmosphere had already begun to change, proof that one person's dignity in the face of discrimination could transform an entire community. 6 months later, Michelle stood at the podium in the shopping district's Central Plaza, preparing to cut the ribbon for her 4th boutique. The crowd gathered for the opening was diverse, a visible sign of how much had changed since that fateful night. "When I started this business," she began, her voice carrying across the plaza, "I dreamed of creating beautiful spaces where everyone would feel welcome." She paused, looking at the faces before her. Sometimes it takes a difficult moment to turn dreams into reality. The new security team stood at their posts, wearing redesigned uniforms that emphasized service over authority. Each guard had completed the comprehensive training program Michelle had helped develop. More importantly, they'd embraced the district's new culture of respect and inclusion. In the front row, her grandfather sat beaming with pride. Next to him was Lisa, a young entrepreneur from Michelle's mentorship program who would be opening her own store next month. The program had already helped launch 5 new businesses, with more in the pipeline. The real measure of success isn't just in sales figures, Michelle continued, gesturing to the shopping district around them. It's in creating a community where everyone can thrive. The district's profits had actually increased since implementing the new policies, proving that doing the right thing could also be good for business. The crowd included familiar faces from that night 6 months ago. Officer Rodriguez and Lieutenant Chen were there, now regular participants in community outreach programs. Several store owners who'd spoken up at that first meeting stood nearby, their own businesses flourishing in the district's renewed atmosphere. "We've turned a moment of darkness into a beacon of light," Michelle said, her words resonating with those who knew the full story. The security footage from that night was now used in training sessions across the country, teaching others how to prevent similar incidents and respond to discrimination. The local business association had adopted Michelle's security protocols as their standard. Other shopping districts were following suit, creating a ripple effect of positive change throughout the retail industry. What had started as one woman's humiliating experience had grown into a movement for retail equality. A group of young business students stood at the back of the crowd, taking notes. They were part of a new internship program Michelle had started, learning firsthand about ethical business practices and inclusive leadership. Their presence represented the future she was helping to build. "Today isn't just about opening another store," Michelle explained, her hand resting on the ribbon. "It's about opening doors for others." The crowd applauded, understanding the deeper meaning behind her words. Many of them had their own stories of facing prejudice, but now they also had hope for change. The district's board members, who had initially been hesitant about the sweeping changes, now proudly showcased their transformation. The shopping district had become a case study in successful diversity initiatives, featured in business magazines and taught in management courses. Michelle's mother dabbed at her eyes in the front row, remembering the night she'd rushed to bring her daughter breakfast after the incident. Now, 6 months later, she was watching that same daughter turn a painful experience into a platform for positive change. "The keys to progress," Michelle said, lifting the scissors, "are courage, compassion, and commitment to doing what's right." As she cut the ribbon, cheers erupted from the crowd. The new store's windows reflected the sunlight, along with the faces of a community united in celebration. Inside the new boutique, the walls displayed photographs of successful entrepreneurs from all backgrounds, graduates of Michelle's mentorship program. Each image told a story of determination and achievement, inspiring the next generation of business leaders. After the ceremony, as people explored the new store, Michelle overheard a young girl asking her mother if she could own a shop someday. The mother's immediate yes and the girl's beaming smile represented everything Michelle had been fighting for, a future where dreams wouldn't be limited by prejudice. The jazz music playing softly through the store's speakers was the same playlist from that pivotal night, but now it carried a different meaning. It had become a symbol of resilience, of maintaining grace under pressure, of turning adversity into opportunity. As the sun set on the opening day, Michelle stood in her new store's doorway, watching families and friends shopping together, security guards greeting customers with genuine smiles, and store owners chatting across cultural barriers that had once seemed insurmountable. This was more than a happy ending, it was a new beginning.